Great. Well, I'll just start by welcoming everyone. I know many of you and some of you I don't, but Matt and I are glad to be the facilitators of this committee and this part of the process. Our goal is to really listen to as many constituents as possible and then come up with a recommendation on governance and how we could assure that the White River Vision Plan moves forward, which is something that I think we all have an interest in. And so we've really been enlightened and learned a lot, and want to learn more by listening to all of you today. Matt?
As usual, Sam said it perfectly, so just welcome everyone and thank you. Get over to you, Brad.
All right, so thank you everyone for joining us today to talk about the White River implementation. Today we have a series of some great stakeholders from a wide variety of perspectives, but we've got representatives talking about regional perspective, kind of neighborhood community perspective, and then the equity perspective. And so this is quite a timely conversation for what's going on in our nation. So I want to acknowledge that we all have a long ways to go, and this everything that you panelists say here today is really important to the conversation. And so I'm going to go around and ask the panelists to introduce themselves. I'll kind of nominate you just to keep us in order. And so if you could just share your name and kind of your organization or affiliation, and we'll start with Rob.
My name, excuse me, Rob Vesprille. Northern part of Hamilton County. I live about 2 miles from Katiwi Park and about a half mile from Lafayette Trace Park. So sort of in between. We've got I don't know, I've never measured it, maybe a couple miles of river frontage here. We've got some floodplain that we farm quite a bit of green space and acreage. So we're just, and I also live on the river, so I watch every weekend hundreds of canoes and kayaks go by. So it's a good place to be, and we enjoy it. I've been here most of our lives.
All right, great. Thank you, Rob. Olgen Williams.
Yeah, thank you. Olgen Williams. I live in Hallville, USA. I live about 1.25 miles from the river. I've been working in the community about 48 years and dealing with the White River issue since, I guess, somewhat since Mayor Goldsmith, Regional Park. I came up, and as a community person, I'm retired now in the near west side community, concerned about the river, the future of it. Further south you live on the river, the more the junk you receive, and the less usable it is for us. With the dam collapsing, we have lots of dry spots now, just a challenge there. And people want to be able to use the river, perhaps, but we can't see that in the future because of all the problems we have with environmental issues, of course. People still fish in the river. Lots of good smallmouth bass in there. And the further south you go, they fish even more. And we still have flooding, a little south of Washington Street. Bike trail you can't ride because of the flood and stuff. So the big concern is the development of it. We do have some apartments being built on the river this year, and people want to be able to use it. They talk about a beach, but not a usable beach. Lots of vision plans here. Concerning it, of course. But again, the biggest concern is not being part of the planning as they move future, as we see many years in the past of lack of neighborhood commitment or input when it comes to plan. And I guess one of the concerns is that at the end of the day, our part of the river, they just shuck it and put a riverboat on it or something, start gambling, and then all the other stuff go away. So it does come up quite a bit with it, but we have lots of players that come in the community that necessarily not zip code tested for this part of the river, want to do for this part of the river. And we have concerns about that. We want to be partners with them, not an outside entity with that said. We have some ideas about what we'd like to see, but it depends on what side of the river you live on. I live on the west side, of course. what's going on. So I'm here to listen primarily and to address some concerns. I'm kind of radicalized about the river, what we see flooding. In the history of for many years, this neighborhood has used this river, Hallville. They used to swim in it, different spots and places, but now it's a little different, of course, especially with the drying up of it. And we want to know what the city gonna do. We know what the citizens is doing, building their dam up north, but what would the city of Indianapolis do concerning their part of it, moving in the future?
All right, thank you, Olgen, for joining us. Tom Kilian.
Thanks, Brad. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Kilian. I'm the president of the Hamilton County Community Foundation and also the president of Impact Central Indiana, which is a new line of business that facilitates social impact investments for the Indianapolis Foundation, CICF, and Hamilton County Community Foundation.
All right, great. Mark Fisher.
Hi, Mark Fisher with the Indy Chamber. Chief Policy Officer, do a lot on economic development and regional governance policy. Been spending a large portion of my career on regional cooperation, regional governance, most recently at the General Assembly. So on a personal note, I live in Butler, Tarkington, and spend a lot of time between the canal and the river. And my son's favorite place to spend time in town is on the river. So just looking forward to the opportunities.
All right, great. Pastor Greene.
I'm a senior pastor of Purpose of Life Ministries and president of the Concerned Clergy of Indianapolis. And as a part of the Concerned Clergy, we're just concerned about, excited about what's going to happen on the White River. Hopefully we'll make a lot of progress, but want to make sure that's done with equity.
All right, thank you. Phyllis.
Hi, everybody. Phyllis Boyd, Executive Director of Groundwork Indy. We work with youth in Marion County on various community-based projects, primarily outdoors. And we've done a lot actually with the canal and with the river. And we're actually located right on the Central Canal at Birdsville Parkway.
Great. Anna Gremling.
Sorry, muting issues. Anna Gremling with the Indianapolis Metropolitan Planning Organization. For those of you that don't know, because I see a lot of unfamiliar names, we are a regional transportation planning organization, not only covering Indianapolis, but as far north as Arcadia, as far south as Franklin, from Danville to Cumberland. So we really work on not only transportation, roadway infrastructure, but bike ped and transit.
All right, great. I also want to point out that Janet Arnold is on the call. Janet is a Visit Indy staffer. She's our VP for partnership. And so she's just here to listen in to see how her team might be able to help us. All right, and so with that, thank you all for those of you that have been able to submit the written briefs. Those have been distributed to the team, and we've also had some others provide those to us as well. And so the committee's had a chance to review those and read those, and now I'll just open it up to the committee for questions to our panel.
I'll start.
Go for it, Brenda.
Okay, well, Betsy, usually Betsy, your letters are before mine, so you should probably start. I'm Brenda Myers with Hamilton County Tourism. A consistent theme throughout these has been a worry of redundancy. I saw it, and a worry, whether it was a worry of redundancy because you are an organization or a person who, I mean, I like one of the, Rob knows I talked to Jim Flanders, and his brief is in your packet, and he, you know, he said, I already have enough people that I have to deal with when I want to get something done. You know, am I going to have to go up another layer, or are you going to be a consolidator or a convener of these kinds of things? And I noticed it on some other briefs. Can anybody talk to us a little bit more about that worry about redundancy, and overlapping, jurisdictional, whatever? I'm going to call on you if you don't. Rob, explain to me what has to happen when you want to do something on your farm, and or what would worry you about this?
Well, currently with most of our river ground, it's in floodplains, so there's not, any development potential. We don't try to do anything on it other than farm it. Obviously, we've made a lot of choices over the years, from erosion control to how we apply herbicides and fertilizers for runoff, to mitigate those type of things, which is a benefit to us as well as the river. As far as working with government entities, again, from the river standpoint, I really don't have a lot of issues there. My biggest problem would be, the floodplains haven't been protected like they should be. Hamilton County, when they bought the Katiwi Park from the Taylor family, within a short amount of time, they built up that roadway. Both sides of that road used to flood, and now you really only have one side of that road flooding. That's 400 or 500 acres that aren't flooding as quickly as they would have before that was done. If I were to try to do that as a private landowner, I would never be able to do that. I would have everybody down my throat if I tried to do anything in floodplain. So what that does, it just backs up on us quicker. So now, a 2-inch rain, maybe the river doesn't come out of my house. But with that, it might come out a little sooner than it would have. So those are my frustrations in seeing things like that happen. Other than that, we see a lot of issues in the river with things that it just hasn't been maintained. I mean, there's nobody that will take responsibility for the islands and the things like that have built up over the years. We've talked about dredging and doing different things to help, get better flow, but there's no money, number one, and there's just no consensus on, who would take ownership of that. So I guess that's my main responsibilities, my concerns, Brenda.
Well, Rob, related to that, Jim shared concerns about flooding has changed, and it's clearly impacting his property. Have you seen increased flooding in your floodplain, and has that caused you?
Yes, we have increased floodplains, regardless of what seat you sit in on the climate topic. It's changed. I mean, we get bigger events now. We don't get as moderate as rainfalls as we used to. And with all the development that's happened in the past 20 plus years, I'm in the northern part of the county, but Noblesville South, all the parking lots, all the runoff, the river fills up quicker. So that's helping raise the water levels up here. So that's a big concern as well.
Do you have any estimates on the economic impact of what that means to you?
Well, people say, well, you've got crop insurance. Well, crop insurance isn't like auto insurance. It works totally differently. If you have a lot of claims, it gets to the point where you might as well not buy crop insurance because the premium levels increase to a level that, is not sustainable. So that would be, that's probably the biggest hurdle. We just see water rising at a quicker rate than it used to. We've done ditching, we've done things to try to get the water off quicker. We can sustain about 5 days with water on our crops. After that, you're going to be replanting.
Thank you.
What would be a good initial area of focus? So I guess let me step back. First, I want to say thank you, because the reading ahead of time is always very helpful to set an understanding of where folks are coming from. and gives us time to really prepare and have an appreciation for the dialogue. There was actually a great amount of consistency, I thought, across the information that we saw for this particular panel, and actually consistency with some of the other panels on the environmental issues. But obviously some different ones here that we need to work through. So I'd love to hear from each of you what kind of in a very purposeful sense, what would be the best initial focus? If this gets running, where should effort be spent in kind of the immediate term?
Betsy, I can jump in first here on this one. You know, it's interesting as this project and has really come to fruition, and we've watched this take some shape. I think there's all kinds of great ideas that people have come up with, and we think about the economic development opportunities, and we think about the recreation. But what's become clear to me in this process is that we have got to address the health of this river system before we do anything. And while I would say that that's not maybe as exciting for our communities to watch take shape, what I would tell you is I think the infrastructure piece of this has got to be addressed before we move forward with other elements.
Thank you.
I'm going to call on Pastor Greene next. We've had some conversations about some things that you're already hearing, especially in the Riverside community. You want to share some of those thoughts?
Sure. Some of the concern from our community is the gentrification piece of the impact of this particular project in terms of people with existing homeowners, et cetera, being pushed out, bought out, or removed. And then there's no strategy as, okay, where these people are going. It's more about movement on the way out. And then in support of what Tom is saying, if we're going to attack the river from the beginning, I think we need to set the tone for doing that with equity and diversity so that it's a win-win and builds momentum for the entire project so it doesn't look one-sided. We don't want it to look like a group of people are just coming in, wiping out areas of the community, and a minority community be totally left out.
What would be a good initial focus in your mind?
We could start with the environmental piece as long as we make sure we include minorities as a piece of the work, the labor force, the economic opportunities as a part of it. We still need to, continue to look at, and hopefully not developers that are already going in, swooping up property, anticipating this project ahead of time. That's a real concern as well.
Can I just piggyback on both Pastor Greene's and Tom's comments? I do think the infrastructure piece, particularly green infrastructure, is something that we need to be thinking about for the watershed. We've made a huge investment in the Deep Tunnel project, but we all know that that's not enough. And if we're thinking about workforce development related to addressing these environmental concerns, actually there's a huge opportunity with respect to green infrastructure, looking at deep paving areas that don't need to have pavement anymore, or even, putting in green infrastructure in new developments and things like that. So I think it would make sense to have that be a big priority in this first phase.
So how about
this is Emily Krueger.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask, I think it was very clear in the brief how important it is to make sure that our diverse voices are heard throughout this process. And I think we're all even more aware of that right now with what's going on in our city and world. And I'm just curious, before jumping to solutions, which was, I think, also something that was a takeaway from those briefs. I mean, what are your recommendations to this group? How do we ensure that a diversity of voices is heard in terms of this process? What are your recommendations to make sure that we do that?
Can I piggyback on that question? I think one of the things that the transition team is wrestling with is this idea that if you've read through the brief, you understand that if you read through the White River Vision Plan, which is supposed to be not a 5,000 foot plan, but a 25,000 foot plan, but it talks a lot about the pressure on the governance team to have governmental teeth, right? Opportunity and teeth, but also philanthropic opportunities for people, for the entity to go out and seek additional funds. There's a funding mechanism on each. They're both important. And so we've talked a lot in these conversations or post conversations about who should sit on this team. So when you're talking about diversity and making sure we have a voice at the table, without having the committee be 30 people, without having the governance team be 30 people, how do we ensure that moving forward, that the 13,000 voices that had an input into the plan, that their voices continue to be heard loud and clear, that there's a responsibility by this governance team to make sure that people like you who live and own property on the river, or are like the stakeholders group that we had, that they're heard, and that bigger institutions do not overwhelm the smaller institutions. So it's the same question, but just expanding it a little bit.
Emily and Brenda, I mean, I think I would go back to a bit of what Pastor Greene was saying. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we've got to make sure that people of color are involved in this process, both now on the governance piece, as well as all aspects of this evolving and moving forward. Partnering with CICF in this journey of creating equitable opportunity for all of our neighbors and residents of our community has really taught me a lot of things, but one thing very clearly, and that is that we have got to engage people of color in this process. They have to be a part of our organizations. They have to be a part of the leadership, part of the decision making. Otherwise, I think that moving what we say into action becomes very difficult. So whether it's a governance committee of 5 or 30, I think there has got to be appropriate representation. And again, as Pastor said, they've got to be, our residents and neighbors of color have got to be engaged and part of the leadership of this process.
This is Olgen. I agree with that part of it. And I live in this area, and our concern is the neighborhood community. You have a community like Springtown, primary, not a community of color, but had the same concern that I do because we're neighbors and they live close to the river. We have to look at the economic diversity as well. Everybody can't live a certain way on the river, but they do live on the river. And the feeling is that we get dumped, and the truth still need to be made known what the river really look like, what's still going on, how much sewage is going in the river, how much is coming down on our end, how the dam collapse and affect us. The water companies probably don't even want to use the water. It's still so bad. And if you live here and watch it close enough, you see how bad it is, and lots of people fish on it. But I think that Reverend Greene said it, the gentrification is a concern for the near west side because rivers look like a prime spot, people building close to the river, on the river. If you look at the people that's doing it, they don't necessarily have a history of this community, necessarily economically or culturally wise look like anything like the people live there. But yet they are getting the prime spots and they're moving in there, and we get less input. We want to be, the south part of the river want to be treated just as well as the north part when it comes to development, and have the same amount of voice and the same amount of opportunity at the same amount of time. In other words, we want to be represented as just the same. Yeah. Hey, you can have a small one, but I don't care about the size. I just want to make sure the representation of it. You can control size with the right leadership, but we have to have an input. Our future is here. You know, I'm not planning on moving in the place, and lots of people not planning on moving, but we want to stay here. But we need to have that input. And our biggest concern actually is the environment. How we see what the river looked like at time, and what's going in the river. Certain pipes still in the river is dumping sewage. You know, and I have people that work for these, know people that work for the citizens and stuff, and different ones that tell us what's going on that we don't hear about. We need truth first. We need a true report about what's going on in the environment, so in order to attack that part of it.
So I'm going to pick on Anna. Anna runs an organization that has to balance lots of competing voices across a region. You just want to share your experience of how your board's structured, kind of the pluses and minuses of that?
It's incredibly difficult, right? So for those that aren't aware, every time you fill up at the gas pump, you pay a federal gas tax. We get a portion of that back here in Indianapolis to the tune of $50 million. We've come up with a very quantitative process based on the roadway, number of users on the roadway for distribution of funding. But the idea is it's supposed to be a regional board that decides on regional priorities for transportation and distribution of funding. It's oftentimes very difficult for people to take off their municipal hat or their jurisdiction hat and think about the common good of the region. I will say some communities or partners or key players may be better at that than others. But it is very difficult. I will tell you, I think on the regional level, our board lacks diversity, and that's because our board's required to be elected officials. But I do think that's a challenge. Not insurmountable, but it is something that the group should think about.
To piggyback off that, I do have a question for you. In a few of the other panels that we've had, that topic has come up. How do you balance having elected officials in the mix with residents and other stakeholders in the community? So what's how do you feel about that? What do you think that structure should look like in order for elected officials to be able to be accountable to the people that they represent in the region, but also involve people that are directly involved as well?
So if I were developing it, the board structure would include elected officials as well as some at-large stakeholders that are non-elected officials that represent either stakeholders along the river or maybe the diverse population or something that's not already represented at the table. So you have the elected officials there for the accountability aspect, the local match, to go after funding. And then you have the stakeholders to kind of bring in the public piece of it for the stakeholder feedback.
Is there, what I gather when we talk about this is typically, and what I read from briefs here and in others, is that the desire to have elected officials has in large part to do with creating accountability for this governance entity. So is there another way to create accountability without having elected officials be a required component of the governance entity? And I'm not saying it needs to go one way or the other. I just want to explore all of the options, because
Anna,
The core
So-
seems to be accountability.
So in the past, if you look to examples of the Hoosier Heritage Port Authority, each community or jurisdiction was given seats, and that elected official, the highest elected official, was allowed to select, right, people to represent their community. Is another way to approach that without having the elected official themselves, because right, oftentimes they're very busy.
I think this is Mark Fisher. I think too, you look at, Indigo board, you have appointing authorities. You have the CIB, which is technically a regional body with regional appointees. Even though, and then you've got the airport authority, which has regional appointees. I know for municipal corporations for Marion County, even though there's an appointment and those boards develop and approve their own budgets, the city county council ultimately has to approve those budgets as well. I think the process is they can reject them, or I know at one point that they didn't have the ability to alter it. It was, hey, we're going to accept your budget or you're not. But I do believe that in some cases they're able to alter the board approved budgets. But so you have kind of a appointing authority and then a second layer of budgetary approval, annual budgetary authority as well.
How do you avoid cycles? Because one of my biggest concerns is that when elected officials are involved, you are moving with a party and not always a community. Sometimes a community, sometimes not. And when elected officials turn over, even if it's appointed, could have a majority newly appointed board with no history of an organization. So the connections and the trust that was built with communities, the understanding of the history of processes is lost because you've had party switchover and elected officials. So
I know that there's party affiliation, or you can have no more than so many of the same party per your appointees. And there's also, for certain boards, there are terms that transcend an administrative term. And so, and just one thing, this is a lot of tension, guys, at the General Assembly. Because Betsy, as you know, when the RDAs were created for regional cities, they expressly prohibited elected officials. There are some communities that really like that model. I would say that is not the case in Central Indiana. As we've talked about regional governance models, new forms of RDAs, new empowerments for the MPO, as they kind of mature into a council of governments, that it has been strictly required or advocated for direct appointment of elected officials on those bodies. I do not see a scenario where you do not have elected officials on some regional governing body for this purpose.
Matt, if you're trying to speak, you're muted.
Yeah, Mark, can you speak to that in terms of, and Anna, both in terms of your perspectives as to majority, minority in that? I mean, participation is one thing. Do you see that as, what do you see the mix?
It is very, very tough. And to be quite frank, the transit legislation of the State House, it was tripped up for 3 years on regional governance and how you create that. Because the original plan was a regional transit authority or regional transit district. And there are still and for the right reasons, very, very raw feelings about Unigov still, and for good reason. And there was a concern amongst Marion County legislators that there wasn't going to be a proportional representation on a regional body. And so Marion County legislators were some of those most forceful against this regional transit district early on in the transit discussion. Now we've gone to a county by county approach, But maybe, I don't know, maybe CERTA, Anna, is maybe a good example of elected officials and their appointees and private sector folks. And kind of it delineated who got a seat at the table. That might be a good model that kind of mixes those two together.
And I just want to add for consistency of the board's sake, and I think Mark mentioned this, but not only having term limits, but have half of your board turnover, every 2 years, and then 2 years the other half. So you're not having complete turnover of your board at once. And so that helps a little bit with the election cycles and who's in control and kind of what's happening at the time, to protect at least 50% of your board will be around a while. So that's just another recommendation.
I get some of the neighborhood leader perspective here. None of you are elected. Olgen was deputy mayor, but not elected. What's your perspective about who sits on this committee, the balance of...
Thank you for the pool.
The balance of elected officials, the typicals, versus neighborhood stakeholders?
And this is tough. Sam knows. How many times have they tried to say, the IPS, we got to get rid of school boards, right? Because they're just not going to make the change fast enough that we need. But those are direct representatives of the community. And so I think you've got to be very careful with an all appointee board, where I think you will have more buy-in if there are elected representatives on that body that are directly represented by the neighborhoods, by those communities.
We also have to have a certain level of expertise when you're talking about managing the river as a linear park or as a natural asset. And probably that's one of the reasons it's in the condition it is, because we haven't listened enough to people with the expertise of how you manage a river healthily, successfully.
So
Any thoughts
I'm gonna,
about the level of expertise or the kinds of expertise you want to make sure are in the room going forward if the vision plan is to be achieved?
Sam, can you ask that question again?
Sam, sorry, can some of that be addressed by professional staffing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's probably, I was just wondering about the, so you don't end up with a group of, 30 or 40. You want to make sure the expertise is in the room as well as the representation is in the room. The citizen representation is important, but the expertise seems to be really important too. But as Mark points out, it could be invited, or maybe that's the staff's role.
Yeah, so Anna, you've got an amazing set of professional staff, and you've also got a policy committee and a technical committee. What in reality, I know this is being recorded, so you're on record. So in reality, what is the balance of power really when it comes to making funding allocations between staff and board because of the technical expertise?
Yeah, so we do have two levels, as Brad indicated. We have a policy level, so that's our board level, and then we have a technical committee. The technical committee, for our purposes, is made up of engineers and planners, and essentially the technical committee helped us come up with clear technical objectives on how to distribute transportation funds. We came up with those objectives, right? That's how we scored all of the projects that were submitted within Indianapolis. And then we would come up with staff recommendations. We take those back to not only the technical committee, but the full board for adoption of approval. So in this case, do you have a spin-off committee, right, of technical experts that are either hired or, right, are concerned citizens that really help drive input into your process on their thoughts and opinions It's just one way to approach it. That's how we handle it. But yeah, I think you could get that help from either subject matter experts in the field to this.
How often are the what's the percentage of technical committee recommendations that are approved versus those that are changed or removed?
So I've been with the agency for 10 years. There was only one change ever made to the recommendation. So they follow the recommendations of the technical experts. They may not like it, right? There may be times that there are other projects that don't score well, but I think it is a process, and everybody bought into the process, and we spent quite a bit of time developing the process. It doesn't get overturned for political reasons at any whim.
I think that's a great analogy. So I know just enough about you to be dangerous, so I apologize, but you do control a pot of money, right? So that is a nice leverage. But I know you try to do the right thing. And so you created the regional pedestrian plan, right? Is that the
correct? Yep.
So let's equate the regional pedestrian plan to the White River Vision Plan, right? Here's a regional, so now you need Carmel, Fishers, Noblesville, Indianapolis they all bought into that plan in the planning process, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how is the resident considered who, so for instance, Rob does not want a trail in his backyard, right? So we all come up with a Greenways plan, and the Greenways plan has a trail along the river up in Northeast Hamilton County. And we've said in the White River Vision Plan, we're going to respect the rights of property owners, right? I mean, it's one of our key principles. And yet, so you're saying that, and this is where leadership, and Betsy mentioned it last time, and really strong leadership is going to be critically important to guide that process through, to make sure that those people, when we get down to that granular level to start creating those specific plans for implementation, that we guide and get everybody to buy into it. So on the pedestrian plan, just walk me through real quickly how you did that and how you made sure you had public input on that.
So it happens at a couple of fronts, right? So we really incentivize our locals to get public input before they bring their plans to us. And if they don't, right, we take points away from them, right? If this is just an idea on the back of a napkin that you haven't run by and vetted through your public, right? It's kind of just that, an idea on the back of a napkin. Not that we wouldn't consider it, but we really drive and try to push that communities talk to their locals. Sometimes it's not always in my role as a regional person to be talking in X community about a path that they're pushing forward because it's their path. And so we really drive and push forward, right, through our scoring process, that people do the right thing by engaging their public. Not that, and so for you guys on how you push that, it may be a little bit different, right? Because we do have the carrot.
How do you score for equity and things like the diversity and equity and things like that? How do you, is that explicit or?
That has been really, honestly, a challenge. So a good example of that is 38th Street. So those that are kind of the neighborhood in front of the fairgrounds really wants to slow down traffic, narrow the lanes, add an excluded bus lane specifically related to the purple line. And we have 38th Street east of that, right, that doesn't necessarily want the dedicated bus lane. And it's right just miles apart. And so it's really pushing to have those conversations. There's not one right answer or wrong answer on how a neighborhood or a community wants a neighborhood or street system to look. We really try to drive to have those conversations at the local level because it doesn't, it doesn't work well to have those conversations at the regional level.
I do want to add, though, I think in terms of the idea of having technical experts, I don't think we can assume that someone that's maybe an expert in infrastructure is an expert in equity.
Oh yeah.
How to look at that. And so if we're thinking in the future about having technical expertise, I think that also needs to include folks that really understand how to do equity. And so, and how to apply that to engineering solutions, how to apply that to other things. And so an engineer might not necessarily be paying attention to pedestrian deaths as opposed to the movement of cars, right? So what are we paying attention to as experts is going to really determine whether or not we're being equitable.
Mm-hmm. And we rely on a number of firms around the region, Engaging Solutions, Heard Strategies, to name a few, to help us with conversations. And depending on what we're trying to do, what our engagement strategies are. So we have a lot of tools in our toolbox, from Facebook advertising to online strategies to beauty shops and barber shops conversations that we've implemented over the years. It just depends on what project we're pursuing and what level of engagement we think is appropriate.
So let me piggyback on that comment, Phyllis, a little bit. When you think about the governance entity or the operating entity, because there are two different components, right? That this group is going to decide on the governance entity, makeup, parameters, but they will have a huge say, obviously, in the operating entity. What expertise is needed on the governance entity?
I'm not really sure how to parse out what types of individuals you need in order to specifically be able to deal with issues of equity. Obviously, an easy route is to say you've got to have persons of color. But not even a person of color, not all persons of color necessarily have the expertise to really embed equity in process. I think you have to really, yeah, you just can't take it for granted that it's going to be any person of color. That's not sufficient.
That would speak to the expertise as defining that clearly, right? Is that that there needs to be an expertise in equity that is defined as however that gets defined. Would that be a solution to that? In quote the job description of of defining expertise?
I think so. And what has it looked like for that person to have really been a champion or done the work of doing equity in whatever field they're in. And you just can't assume that, skin color is the badge that is happening.
So I want to bring Robin in here. One of the most enlightening realizations I had during this planning process was the same fear that we have in Marion County's core neighborhoods about gentrification and displacement, about losing land that has belonged in families for generations, is the same thing that many of our rural neighbors up in Hamilton County feel. Different issues, but kind of the same fear. So Rob, can I just get kind of your thoughts on how, your perspective of agriculture, of generational farming, of all that, how that should be represented on a regional structure?
Brenda's heard me preach on this a few times, but we love what we have up here. We love this rural life, and it's not just a lifestyle. It's our labor. This is what we've done for, you know, hundreds of years as some of the families up here. And I'm more than happy to share the river with anybody. You know, the river is a great asset. But as far as, you know, we talk about trails, we hear the word trails a lot. Brenda mentioned that earlier. We have to have ways to get to these access points of the river. We don't need a trail along the whole river, but we do need access points. And right now we've got parks. We don't have a lot up here like you have down south. We've got quite a few areas, and people want to expand on that. And I'm all for, you know, corridors, bike trails, whatever, along current right-of-ways, the roads, for instance. But I will never support the use of eminent domain in Marion County or Hamilton County or any county for recreational purposes. I will never go there. I think that is not what eminent domain was designed for. So the impact that has on families and farms and generations is, you know, we've had some of that, but it's this kind of thing is what really raises the ire up here and makes all this suspect. You know, I'm here, you know, looking, you know, at that from that viewpoint. I want to make sure, you know, that we have a seat at the table, and it's a valid seat. That's, you know, I sit on a couple different boards. We're talking about bringing particular expertise in. You know, we have non-voting advisory people that come in. We appoint them. We've had some that have been on our board for several years. Boards, and some are 6 months. That, you know, a term. We need them for a certain project or something, so they can come and go in a non-voting capacity, and they're appointed. We just utilize their expertise. I'm sort of bridging here, but you've got to have people represented here that are vested in this river corridor. You know, I could see this turning into, you know, we've got a nice setup here, and then 5 years down the road, it evolves into this, you know, corporate government structure that, you know, there's no more boots on the ground, boots on the ground kind of situation, and that scares me.
To that point, I have another question. One of the points that I found interesting was talking about the importance of residents in the process, obviously, but transparency and how information is relayed to stakeholders. You know, particularly this is from Brad Beavers, and he said, information should be proactively communicated to residents who deserve to know and distributed to them in a way that people will actually get it. So what does that mean for each of you? How is best for this governance structure to communicate with you?
I'm sure Emily and the DMD team know that the kind of the shortcomings of public meetings where decisions are made, especially in the middle of the day. You know, outreach has to take multiple forms. You know, electronic. The most impactful, ironically, the most impactful way I know something's happening in my neighborhood is those orange signs. I mean, it's the most basic yard sign saying, hey, something's happening right here. Go to this website to figure it out, because it's done on my own time, right? And something that I can see for myself, but it's got to be multiple ways and multiple times of the day for people to truly participate.
Mark, I'm not sure I thought of orange yard signs, but good idea. You know, I think as a community foundation, when we think about communicating and trying to be proactive in that regard, that idea of engagement occurs before decisions are made. So I think engaging and convening with groups to have those conversations and understand specifically where people stand on particular situations is important. But I think ultimately it will take really a combined effort of this group moving forward in regard to that idea of proactive engagement.
So Olgen, early on, you talked a lot about wanting to know what's in the river, what's coming down, what citizens is doing, what the city's doing. How best do we do that for Hawville?
Well, we have from 16th Street down south of Washington Street, we have 4 neighborhoods that is represented along the river that's concerned about it. And we work through Near West, but we also come together and share information and getting information out to the Near West Collaborative and to these different groups spreads the word out in our meetings, and we share it with residents. You know, as we get more people involved, we're getting lots of new people that we had to contact also that don't know we exist because they moved into the neighborhood. That's one concern. And the people we're talking about have been here for 50, 40 years, living this close to the river and working with universities. So I think communicating with the organizations, using the different tools the city has now in place and the different things that Indianapolis Neighborhood Resource Center is doing, keep us informed. And but we got to be informed early enough, and we got to be accommodating for the working residents to be able to engage the conversation. I'm retired, so I can go to meetings anytime. It's easy for me to say, but I know most of the people I work with represent can't be there. And I don't want to speak for them all the time. I got my own opinion. I think how you're doing it can work very well, but the representation though is critical. We can, you know, I'm a neighborhood guy. I believe in neighborhood empowerment. You know, people that zip code tested has the most vested interest in any project you're doing. Living on the river, close to the river, we got to see it, we got to smell it, you know, and we may have to drink it. I don't know what the water company is going to do. So we definitely want to keep informed, but we want to be empowered to be able to make the decision. I don't want to just hear you talk about it. I want to be, and I say me, not so me, but the representation to be able to make those votes or be empowered. Like Reverend Greene said, gentrification is a big concern. In order to make that not happen as fast as it's going to happen, the people that's concerned need to be at the table and giving their ideas and their concern. And it's all right. People are going to move in the neighborhood, but they need to be engaged early as soon as possible. You know, we feel like, you know, south of the river, we get dumped on. And, you know, that's always a feeling. You know, use that expression. But I think communicating to the groups, and the groups get it out, and then, but you got to check with the group, or some way check, make sure the groups are doing their job.
I've got an additional question. There were 2 themes that have shown up in terms of areas of focus. One very strong theme has been environmental, improving and protecting the health of the river at every place along the river. The other one has been recreation and utilizing recreation as a way to create awareness of the river, awareness of the health of the river. When I think about equity, and I think about, I shouldn't necessarily say equity, so I'm going to stumble around, and I'm going to apologize because I'm going to stumble around my terms a little bit. But where recreation gets placed makes a big difference, both in terms of what communities get direct benefit from that recreation, but also then what economic development may occur. So where a lovely recreation element gets built means that people will flock to that recreation element. And that also likely means additional taxes could go up in the neighborhood because it's a more desirable neighborhood to live in because there's a recreational amenity that doesn't exist in another place on the river. So by that nature, there is the potential for gentrification because taxes go up, and that can over time push people out of a neighborhood that are of lower income and have been residents for a long time. And that is not what we want to happen. So are there mechanisms that have worked in the past, whether it's in Indianapolis or other places that have been studied, where we can still make sure that communities along the river get access to not just the environmental benefits, because hopefully we do that such that it continues to flow and everybody along the river gets access to that, but that the developmental opportunities, particularly those related to recreation and that benefit the members of the community that are close by, that those get, whether it's distributed equitably, built equitably, but importantly get placed throughout the communities along the river. But how do we prevent the gentrification that will come along with an increased enhancement in a neighborhood asset? So this is a tension for me because I want to make sure folks at every place along the river get access to these opportunities over time, but infrastructure on recreation increases taxes. So how do we balance that?
In my opinion, the best way to do that is the people that are going to make that decision, the group is going to make the decision, have people in that group that represent that energy you talk about to be able to have a vote to say no or yes to that project. In some terms, I mean, a fair vote, not one person or 2 people, but if it's 10 people, it should be enough people there to be able to empower that committee to look out for that community. If you're not at the table as a power player, you have nothing. I don't never come to the table as a beggar. I come to the table as a legitimate representative of my community. And you need people. You can't just have the experts. You can't have the political people. But if you're going to do something in Howellville, I'm just using an example along the river, where you need representation from Howellville to be able to make that vote when they make that vote. As simple as that. If they don't, they just players outside, and it's going to happen anyway. If you're not there being able to, at the power table, it's going to happen anyway without you. So you need to make sure people are at the power table to be able to vote as well as anyone else on that decision, or make sure that they can at least give their opinion when they say no or yes, or why they think that's the best. Other than that, it's going to happen anyway.
Betsy, is your concern that the taxes are going up as a function of increase in assessed valuation?
Yes, I mean, right, historically, if you improve a park and more people decide they want to live near that park because it's nicer than where they live, or over time there's access to that, then half a generation from then, it's typically not fast, but call it 10 to 15 years. If there's a tremendous asset in a community that didn't exist there before, then more people want to live near it because that's a great place for their family.
And I think in the short term, and what Pastor Greene talked about earlier, it's the predatory folks that go into a community. You talk to folks in Riverside and say, look, folks are taking logos off the website of CDCs, plopping on a piece of paper saying we're partnering with them and we want to purchase your house. And so there's a lot of predatory practices on the front end.
Yeah.
You don't even have to wait for 10 or 15 years. And so I think, I don't know what conversations you've had with Renew Indy and the land bank, but I think that there might be an opportunity. And then how do you, and I don't know the answer, but how do you really, as a community, ward off those predatory actions of people misrepresenting who they're working with, what their motivations are, and how, really using scare tactics in some of these neighborhoods to get people to sell houses they've had for their entire life.
Yeah, I mean, Riverside, it's taken significant diligence by a number of people to just vet out every single purchase, because it's, back in the early days of 16 Tech, we were saying that before anything was approved.
And you're seeing that play out just in little ways in terms of where they use recreational and the breach of the Emmericksville Dam, and the whole purpose behind Belmont Beach was to recognize that we didn't have the tools yet fully in place to be able to vet that adequately. You just had a Riverside master planning project built by the community that was there determining what it was, and yet the fight became predominantly led by folks that wanted high-speed watercraft to be able to water ski on a higher bed of water, but they were loosely hid behind recreation for the neighborhood that the neighbors wanted. And so I think some of this is the vetting to get to the truth. And I think in our conversations with whether it was the rural farm that we're worried about, we were talking about earlier, or it's the urban neighborhood, there are legitimate issues of where the very thing we're having a conversation about in our community is privilege, taking advantage that disrupts and continues to disrupt. So I think that part of that is, how do you speak to that? How do you vet that? How do you legislate that?
Yeah. Betsy, I think your question is so absolutely critical to this process, and it's really got to be designed and thought of on the front end. I mean, obviously, we want to create recreational and economic development opportunity in this process, but we've got to ensure that that's done in an equitable manner, as we've talked about. So whether that's provisions that come in on the front end, whether we're talking about housing production, housing retention, the idea of asset building, I think there's got to be protections that this group focuses on the front end, because I think once you're in it and you're looking at a particular project, it's going to be much harder to do on the back end.
Absolutely.
All right, I want to be respectful of time. We are a little over what we asked our panelists to join us for. And so if there's any final questions, please speak up.
Well, my last statement is work with people that live in the community. Sometimes you think you are, but lots of times you're not. You find out you run into lots of glitches. And I just give the example of Belmont Beach. For some reason, people thought that was a great idea, but residents, leadership wasn't representing the community that made that decision. So it changed. So you got to someone has to be there talking to the right people. Who are the right people? You got to find out who they are. We know who they are, but you got to find out who they are. That's not our job for you to do it for them, but you got to be empowered at the table. The residents have to be empowered at the table.
All right, thank you for that. Thank you for all the panelists for joining us. We appreciate all the time you've given us, your thoughts. This probably will not be the last time that you hear from us. You are experts in this field. And so thank you for joining us. You're welcome to stay on the call and listen in, but I know we only asked for your hour. So with that, Matt and Sam.
Great. Well, glad to appreciate all of your participation. Thank you very much. It's been very enlightening. Look forward to future conversations.
Hey, Brad, does the MPO have zoning authority?
No, they do not.
Okay. That has to be granted, right?
Zoning authority is only municipal jurisdictions or counties.
It goes through state statute.
Yeah.
And it's granted to municipalities.
Okay, thanks, Emily.
Well,
all right, so Matt, do you want to go do your, Matt Cohout, you want to do your standard closing question?
Yeah, what's the top, in this area of equity and the governance, and then equity within the governance of oversight of the river? What's the top thing that must be done, and what's the greatest concern? think, thank you, Olgen has presented that very well, but what other thoughts are there?
I thought the panel did a wonderful job. I thought Olgen's comments were, very, very instructive about, that people have to have, people from the neighborhood, people of color have to have real power, right? Not just representation, but power. If they don't have power, then we're just checking a box and not being equitable. And I think that's something that we've learned at CICF over time. I think that's something our white community is learning. I hope we're learning it. I think this last week has been very instructive. And so if we don't have people from the neighborhood of color with power, then it's just a bunch of BS. And I worry about if we have to play to, if we have to have too many elected officials who are white, who can appoint people who are white, then we won't have real power representing the people from the neighborhood at the table. And I think one of the things we're learning is first do no harm. And if we're going to do harm, then we shouldn't even do it. So we got to figure that out. Right? We got to figure out a governance model that enables people to have real power from representing their own neighborhoods that they've been in, both rural white people and, urban Black and brown people. We have to figure that out. Otherwise, we shouldn't even do anything.
And it's also, I mean, I want to really acknowledge the race issue, but it is socioeconomic as well, right? I mean, it's
very much.
I mean, when I look at Riverwood, it is also, and I bet in all of these neighborhoods, the shared consistency is multi-generational ownership, right? Family, family after family, they've been raised there, they raise their kids there. And I mean, I worry the most about the fact that and I want to say that Aaron's not one of these people, but that elected officials tend to, I think that's one of the reasons you got into office, right? They can't help it, right? They have lots of people screaming in their ears, right? And they can't help, and we need them. But I think everybody today said it clearly, and I think do no harm, I wrote that down. It's absolutely, we cannot be an entity that does more harm than good. And in fact, I think has to be an entity that advocates passionately for everybody along the river.
And I know that I said this before. I think that it's important that elected officials be involved in some way, but I am very pro that being a removed way. So even if that's like kind of a reporting structure back to the council or the governing body, I think that's great. Because I think that I tend to agree that a lot of bodies tend to try and involve them, and then there's too many cooks in the kitchen, and then like we've said before, election cycles come up and it just gets messy. So I think that as long as there's some sort of reporting structure, I think that's.
So I have been surprised by the consistency and primary focus across every group that we've talked to, at least from my perspective, of the environment being, the health of the river being a top concern. And perhaps I am being really naive here, but that seems to be one that this body could address in a highly equitable fashion. So maybe because by its nature, there's a significant portion that has to be based in science and fact. Now, where you create things does like where development occurs to allow for better environmental progress. Obviously there's challenges in who gets what there, where do you start? But the consistency in terms of what seems to me as a primary focus is pretty interesting. And I'm also interested in, let me step back. I came into this thinking we've got this truly transformational project for the two counties. To be a community that really does understand that a river runs through it, for some that don't, and to be able to utilize it in many different ways to create it as an incredible asset for the community. In 20, 30 years, that transformation could be just quite phenomenal. I still believe that. But when I started this, I just thought the governance entity needed to do everything all at once. It needs to have the power to do 5 different things all at once, which would be really difficult to get done. But after listening to these conversations, why couldn't we just start with the environment and not actually, be prepared over time for other types of development? But if we start with the environment, we build trust around that. That seems to me that there are less mechanisms we need to do that than we would for many of the other things that we've been talking about and that are in the plan.
And why wouldn't we, I'm sorry, but why would we not just, in the White River Alliance, that's what they do, right?
I don't know the answer to that, Brenda. I mean, I don't know why wouldn't we, but but it hasn't been as successful. So like there's a challenge in that it exists, and now the partners of the White River, but it hasn't led to the success that, I mean, we're still getting everybody saying they need it. So there has to be a way to amplify that and to accelerate it. Maybe that can be done through the White River Alliance. I don't know, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. Let me throw a contrarian viewpoint to that, Betsy, just from the standpoint.
Please.
Just from the standpoint of one of the things that we have observed in the conversations in the gathering phase was that for some people, environmental was it was a polarizing word. Either people were pro or they were anti-environment. It was the broadening of the tent to the potential of beyond that brought them into the tent, and they learned about the environmental realities. And I think what might be happening is an uninformed, broader audience beyond the environmentalists now see environmental as a more important attribute of this opportunity, and that it was the broad intent that enabled that to happen. And I think we're going to see the same thing happening in equity discussions and otherwise. So I think that I agree. We may not have to tackle it all at once. That may be even by my vision too complicated. But I think you want to cast the vision for a runway that stages up. That you start by building out making sure the environmental recovery efforts aren't lost while we simultaneously build the tools that protect equity and ensure sustainability through economy. And it might be a staging within the context of the whole.
I agree. I'm worried that if we don't get into the equity right away, more bad will happen than good. And I also believe, unfortunately, that there's so much policy engaged in the environmental protection of the river, right? I mean, there's just so much policy that I don't know. I mean, I feel like advocacy, if I were to pick one that we start with, it would be just really, really, really good advocacy and messaging. But, I am a communications person, so that would be mine.
Can I create a distinction? Is it communication or is it advocacy in terms of public policy, or both?
And I think you have to have, we've all acknowledged that we need to have better communication about the river for people to care about the river, right? But that public pressure on everybody, but then also let's work it from the other angle, and which I do think we have a number of environmental groups doing. Let's help them. let's help them, and then let's get people. I think one of the great things about the White River Vision Planning process is how many people we interfaced with for, 12 months, week after week after week. And then we went away, and I think it's time to come back and figure out how to do that in some way. It's to me, it's like you have to approach it from both sides, but there's probably 6 sides. You're right. There's many sides, but there's 9 sides actually, but yeah.
I think when it comes to the environment in Indiana, all of our environmental groups are always on the defensive, right? They always have to play defense. They're trying, I'm pretty close to Hoosier Environmental Council, and gosh, the amount of work every year that they do just to keep things from getting worse is amazing. And their wins are usually knocking down a new idea that was going to make the environment worse. And maybe, so if we could help them get on the offense and actually make it better, not just keep it from getting worse, that would be one thing. But you can't also, we've learned that environmental advocacy and social justice or environmental justice go hand in hand. I had an incredible tour of the Riverside area by HEC 6 months ago, and Marianne Glick and other funders and donors and board members of ours got the same tour, and it was an environmental justice or injustice tour, and it's heartbreaking. And so I think those two things go hand in hand, and and I'm sure there's other things, but we got to get on the offense. We got to make it better, not just keep it from getting worse.
I liked in one of our briefs, LaShonda's idea of community organizing with real community organizing principles. It's not just outreach, but true community organizing. And so if we can find a first focus where we can build trust while building a community organizing effort, because that takes time, that takes real time, and manpower, frankly. But if done right, then like Olgen said, you can actually find the people in the community who are the voices of the community, rather than the people that show up at a meeting, which may or may not be the whole voice of the community. So I think the efforts through the plan were phenomenal and dug deep and retrenched several times to do that. I think for purposes of this entity, I liked that idea of enabling community organizing, which is funding to do that, but I could see there being funders for that.
We have a little over 5 minutes. Amy, Emily, Julie, do you have any thoughts?
So I just have a couple thoughts. One is, I think we need to recognize that this similarity of ideas, the 3 themes, which are preserving the environmental integrity of this asset. The second one really is equity that we've talked about. And the third one is really fluid transactions between governance structures. That's another one that we've talked about that needs to stay on the top of this list. The other thing we need to know about this equity conversation is that, number one, we all communicate differently. And as Betsy was just describing, we need a different way to be able to include individuals who are civically engaged and who do have an interest in what we're talking about and communicate in the manner they communicate. There was a comment earlier about simplifying the story. What is it we're trying to do? What is the net impact on a landowner? What's the net impact on the city? To simplify the conversation so we can really talk about the same thing. So I do think there's a collision between scientific environmental information and just bottom line, what does a long-term homeowner, how are they going to be affected by this? So we probably need different storytellers to join us in this conversation. And the other piece of equity that I think came through Pastor Greene, but I hope we don't lose it as part of our operating structure. We're in a new game now as a country, and as certainly as Indianapolis region. And this idea of voice, this idea of power, this idea of who financially benefits from this activity, who has contracts, who has opportunities to shape the outcomes, is something that is perfect timing for us. And this particular governance structure can play a role in that and make certain that it's intentional and that we're all believing in the same thing. All of the narratives said we do want a strong, healthy river to strengthen property values and economic impact. So the storytelling, I think, is going to be key. And I think in the governance structure, the only other thing that I haven't heard yet discussed is, and I think Brenda touched on it, but this feeder system for future leadership. We have the opportunity for this to be a dynamic organization that we understand is going to change over 50 years because the citizens will change and their desires will change. So how do we create knowledge and understanding of how to take care of a river and how to shape great policy and how to be dynamically engaged in soliciting input? So I think there are feeder systems that we can look at for future board members. So we don't just turn over, every 3 or 4 years, half the board, but we have people in that pipeline gently being educated on what the issues are. Gee, how did we solve that? What public entities were involved in that solution? So I think the feeder system, the storytelling system, the huge play that equity means in the entire process will help us underscore the common elements of environmentally sound river and minimal governance.
I love that. I think what I said was I've never been engaged in something where so many young people showed passion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right, the opportunity to have them be young people of all colors and walks of life to be engaged in this so that they can carry this. It's for them and we want them, and they care deeply. Yeah. Not only
it strikes me.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I was just going to say, it strikes me, Amy, you were talking about storytelling from different perspectives and voices. And I've been somewhat struck by the simplicity, I feel like, that Betsy alluded to, just in terms of what the health of the river means to people, regardless of how you want to use it, for recreation, for farming, for development. Whether you call it environmental justice or you call it river recovery or something technical, I think there's something, having heard from these different groups over these last couple of weeks, that shows a clear starting point in terms of just what it means to take care of the asset and improve it so it can be used by the people who are along the river, and for a broader audience too. I just acknowledge, I think the work of engaging residents and getting resident voices, it's really hard work. I don't want to minimize it at all, but just acknowledge, I think there's some real tension that we've heard in terms of, the benefits of having elected representatives potentially on this board, to the benefits of having resident voice, and without creating multiple layers of an organization. I just think that there's a challenge and a tension there that I think has been reinforced to me through these conversations. It's a worthy one to try and tackle through this, but I just underscore that the tension comes clear.
Amy, I just want to reinforce that whole concept of the leadership pipeline, the ability to engage. We talked at the beginning, one of the new frontiers or last frontiers, however you wanted to look at this, was this whole recognition of the citizenry that has a common bond of Indiana, but has this very different uniform, whether it's in rural or urban or Republican or Democrat, and yet you have a shared natural asset called water that is not just the landowner who is on the shore of its bank. That water is everyone's necessity, right? And so the ability to tap into leadership Indianapolis, leadership Hamilton County, the urban leagues, young professionals, Indy Hub, and a whole host of networks of people, and with a given charge to be the public conscience, or the public, they don't have exclusive right, but they have a civic responsibility. You know, Sam, you led a class, whether at one point during that class they were studying the river and how's it going, so that there's kind of this built-in revolving door of talent that's coming in to be a conscience on how the experiments moving forward could be a pretty powerful part of the governance. Not official, unofficial, it's oversight. It's engaging the neighborhoods. Be interesting.
All right, any final thoughts?
I think it seemed like you, as a group, you were kind of summarizing, sort of the answer to the question, what will the governance structure do? And I think communication, advocacy, as hard as that work is, that's clearly there. An environmental champion, protecting the asset for the future, the river as an asset for the future. Then an equity champion, whether that championing equity in a rural sense as well as an urban sense. And then the developer of future leaders. And then also the coordinator of others. There are many other groups that are not going to go away, but could this governance structure add to a more effective coordination of their efforts? Let's just kind of pick that up listening to all of you in the panel earlier.
And I also had a comment. I'm an integrative health specialist, and part of the story as we move into more unity as a global community is, really telling the story about the health of your natural resources should reflect the health of the people who are around them and in them, and really drawing that line for people. So you are a complete reflection of the health of your natural resources. And so that's a mirror for everybody to start to really understand that the artery that runs through their heart is very similar to the artery that runs through their city or their nation. So, part of the story's got to be super personal and unifying in that way.
Good.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Good.
Yeah, very good conversation. So this is our last stakeholder group. We do not have another meeting yet scheduled, but that will be a pretty meaty meeting when we attempt to have conversations to pull all this together. And so I'm going to have some side conversations with Matt and Sam before that gets scheduled. But there may be some interim work that we work on kind of remotely by email in their interim before we meet again, just so we can have a very productive meeting. And I know that Brian is out of the office, I believe, for much of the rest of June. And so we probably won't convene until after the 4th of July. And by that time, COVID restrictions hopefully have lifted. And so we'll see if we can either get in person or get out on the river. I know a couple of you have asked for that opportunity, and we'll see if we can make that happen. Matt and Sam, any closing comments?
Thank you all for your time and effort very much.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, everybody.
Brad. Thanks,
Thank
Sam.
you. Great
Yeah,
job.
wonderful. Thank you. And thanks, Rob, for coming in and talking with us today. Thank you.
Yeah, very helpful.
Appreciate the opportunity, and I apologize to Brad for not responding to emails. You went to my junk email, so until Brenda got a hold of me, I didn't know you were trying to get a hold of me.
I don't go to his junk email, Brad.
All right. Well, I'm glad that you've been able to participate the entire time. I'm glad that you could be here today. So thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye-bye. Thanks,
Everyone
everybody.
take care.
Stay safe.
Bye.